Here are some facts about me. I married too early. She was older than me and pregnant. My poor son. He was only 11 years old. All facts are truth. I am William Shakespeare, an English playwright, poet, and actor, widely regarded as one of the greatest writers in the English language and world literature, known for works such as Hamlet, Romeo and Juliet, and Macbeth. I am ashamed of some things, and some things almost destroyed me. However, it is an integral part of my life. It proves that famous people have the same problems and life challenges as everyone else. Now all about it in more detail. Section 1. I married too early. She was older than me and pregnant. In 1582, when I was just 18, I made a decision that, for some, would seem hasty, and for others scandalous. I married Anne Hathaway, a woman 8 years older than me, who was already pregnant with my child. At that age, I wasn't fully aware of the implications of what I was doing, but the pressure of the situation, compounded by societal expectations, made the decision seem inevitable. Anne was 26 when we married, and she had already been living in Shottery, a small village near Stratford-upon-Avon. I had been living in London, trying to make my way as a playwright and actor, but the news of her pregnancy brought me back to Stratford. It was likely that, in 1582, marriage was seen as the right course of action in such circumstances. In fact, the rapidity of our union could have been viewed as the result of my having to act quickly to protect both Anne and the legitimacy of the child she was carrying. It wasn't uncommon for young men in such situations to marry out of a sense of duty rather than love. Despite the societal norms of the time, there was certainly a level of controversy surrounding the union. There was the age gap between us, and being older might have been viewed as more mature, while I was still a young, ambitious playwright trying to find my place in the world. I imagine that some in our community may have found this significant age difference curious, and possibly even unsettling. Though our marriage would have been legal, it would have raised questions and potentially been seen as unusual or inappropriate for a young man of my age to marry a woman so much older. Another aspect of our marriage that was likely to have caused comment was the fact that Anne was pregnant. In those days, if a woman was pregnant and unmarried, it could cause a great deal of scandal. Being a young man at the time, I didn't fully grasp the weight of that. I simply saw it as something that needed to be resolved. The marriage had to be swift to preserve the child's legitimacy, and perhaps to avoid gossip or worse. But I have often wondered how it shaped our relationship, both in the eyes of others and in how we saw each other. It is often said that Anne and I's marriage may not have been a happy one. Of course, I was away in London for much of our married life, pursuing my career, which likely distanced me from my wife and child. In fact, much of the period in which I wrote my greatest plays, including the ones that brought me fame, I spent far from my home. I had to work tirelessly to establish myself in London's theatre scene, and it's possible that I neglected my family life, focused entirely on my writing and career. And meanwhile, remained in Stratford, raising our children. She had 2 daughters, Susanna, born in 1583, and Judith, born in 1585. I returned to Stratford infrequently, spending more time in the bustling city of London, where the theatre world was thriving. I can only imagine how she must have felt during those years, perhaps alone with our children, while I pursued my ambitions. But while I was away, it's clear that Anne, who had a significant age advantage, was already established in Stratford, and it seems she may have had her own life and interests apart from my professional career. Historians and biographers have often speculated about the nature of our marriage. There are conflicting theories about whether we had a happy or strained relationship, and whether the circumstances surrounding our marriage, especially the quick union driven by Anne's pregnancy, played a role in the difficulties we may have faced later on. But very little is known for certain, and we can only speculate based on the available evidence. One of the most intriguing elements of our marriage is the question of love. It is unclear if we were ever deeply in love, as I was so young when we wed, and I spent much of my life away from Anne, focused on my career. In fact, the historical record does not provide much detail on our personal relationship. It's possible that, as we both aged, we grew distant. Yet, despite the uncertainties surrounding our personal life, we shared 2 children, Susanna and Judith, who have their own place in history. Though it was not uncommon for marriages in the 16th century to be based on practicality and societal expectations rather than romantic love, our relationship still stands out because of its nature. The marriage came about under a sense of urgency, my being young and already caught in the rush of a successful career, and being older and pregnant. From the moment we wed, there were decisions made that were beyond our control, with societal and familial pressures guiding our path. What's perhaps most tragic is that, despite the ambiguity surrounding our marriage, we never seem to have had the time to truly explore what it could have become. My work in London, my rise to fame, and my growing influence in the world of theatre meant that I was often absent. Though I returned to Stratford on occasion, I never truly had the chance to develop a deep relationship with and beyond the practicalities of marriage. In the end, perhaps it's best to see our marriage through the lens of duty, with moments of affection but also moments of personal sacrifice. I, as a young man chasing my dreams in London, and she, as a more grounded figure who remained in Stratford and supported our family. The distance between us may have defined our marriage as much as our time together. What remains, however, is the legacy of our children. Our daughter Susanna would grow up to marry Dr. John Hall, and Judith, our second daughter, would marry Thomas Quiney. They continued the Shakespeare legacy in their own ways. And while much has been speculated about the difficulties in our marriage, our children became important figures in their own right. Perhaps the greatest irony is that, while I wrote so much about the human condition, love, and relationships in my plays, I never fully understood what love could mean in my own marriage. I spent my life exploring human emotion and passion on stage but could not truly grasp them in my own life. And yet my work, the plays, the poetry, endures. It lives on in ways that our marriage, at least in personal terms, may not have. But in this complexity of my personal life, perhaps we find the true heart of who I was, a man who was ambitious, driven, and caught between his personal obligations and the demands of greatness. Section 2. A Strange Family Life. When I moved to London in the late 1580s, it was not only a decision driven by ambition, but also by the practical need to pursue a career in theatre. Stratford-upon-Avon, where I grew up and where my wife and Hathaway and children lived, had little to offer in terms of opportunities for a playwright. London, on the other hand, was bustling with life and energy, a city where the theatre scene was flourishing. But as I embarked on my new life in the capital, the distance between me and my family grew. I did not return to Stratford often, and when I did, it was usually for brief visits. I left behind Anne, my wife, and our children, Susanna, born in 1583, and twins Judith and Hamnet, born in 1585. My absence from their lives was likely felt deeply, especially considering that I was already married at a young age and had responsibilities to my family. As the years passed, there was little documented evidence of my close relationship with them. While I became increasingly successful in London, my family remained in Stratford, where I had married and hastily in 1582, shortly before I left for the city. By the time I had established myself as a playwright, it was clear that I was dedicating much of my time and energy to my career. I wrote, acted, and produced plays, and my name began to gain recognition in the theatre world. I spent significant portions of the year in London, where my life revolved around the theatre scene and the demands of writing. My plays like Hamlet, Macbeth, Othello, and King Lear came to life during this period, yet the personal sacrifices I made for my craft are evident in the strained relationship I had with my family. I was not the first writer or actor to face the challenge of balancing a family life with the pursuit of a career. But in my case, it seems the demands of my work in London overshadowed my familial obligations. I did not provide much documentation of my life at home in Stratford, and the letters, if any, that I might have sent to and or the children have not survived. This suggests that our communication may have been limited, perhaps due to the practicalities of my life as a playwright and actor, or perhaps due to an emotional distance that grew as I immersed myself in the world of the theatre. What's more, the financial situation also played a role in the dynamics of our relationship. I had some success in London, and I made a considerable amount of money from my work, especially as I gained more influence in the theatrical world. But I did not seem to return home often with wealth to spend on my family. Some records show that I bought a house in Stratford, known as New Place, in 1597, which was an effort to secure my place in the town. However, my focus on my business and theatre work kept me away from home for long periods of time. There were undoubtedly moments when I felt guilty for not being there more for Anne and our children. However, there was also an undeniable pull to my work. It was my passion, my career, and the means through which I could rise to prominence. I wrote some of the greatest works of Western literature during these years, but it came at the cost of neglecting my family life. My relationship with Anne, in particular, became more distant over the years. We married in haste when I was 18 and she was 26, with our union possibly influenced by her pregnancy. But after I left for London, the emotional gap between us only seemed to widen. Some biographers speculate that Anne and I did not have a deeply affectionate relationship, especially as I became more famous and consumed by my career, and stayed in Stratford, raising our children while I pursued my ambitions in London. It's possible that, as my fame grew, she felt more like a figure in the background of my life rather than a partner. There are also suggestions that I may have been emotionally distant from my children. As a young man, I left home to pursue my career, and I didn't return often enough to build a close relationship with Susanna, Judith, or Hamnet. In fact, there is no documented evidence that I ever wrote to them, and little is known about how we interacted when I did return to Stratford. Hamnet, my only son, died young in 1596, and his death must have been a devastating blow to me. Yet, there are no surviving letters or personal reflections that describe how I dealt with this tragedy. I can only imagine that, in the midst of my successful career, I had little time to grieve properly or to console my family. When I did return to Stratford, it was often in the context of my business dealings or to attend to matters related to my property. It was not as a father coming home to his children, or a husband returning to his wife. The historical record does not provide evidence of much personal interaction or bonding during these visits. It's possible that Anne and I had grown apart emotionally by then, with her focused on the day-to-day running of our household while I was off writing and acting in London. One of the few glimpses we have into my relationship with Anne comes from my will. In it I left her the second-best bed, a bequest that has sparked much discussion. Some have interpreted this as a sign of affection, as it was a significant gift at the time, while others have seen it as a cold, or even dismissive gesture. The ambiguity of the bequest suggests that our relationship may have been more complex than we might imagine. In many ways, my personal life in Stratford seemed like an afterthought. I spent the majority of my time away, and when I did return, it was often more for business or property matters than to rebuild familial ties. It seems I placed my professional and artistic success above my personal life, and in doing so, I may have lost out on the opportunity to develop deeper relationships with Susanna, Judith, and Hamnet. By the time I retired to Stratford in 1613, I had achieved a great deal of success. But in some ways, the final years of my life seemed disconnected from the world I had spent my early career creating. Stratford, with its more rural and quiet life, must have felt worlds apart from the bustling, energetic London theatre scene that had propelled me to fame. Whether I found peace in retirement, or regret for the years spent away from my family is unclear, but it's evident that the personal sacrifices I made were significant. Ultimately, my family life, with its periods of estrangement and distance, seems to mirror the tension between personal sacrifice and professional ambition that many experience. In the end, I left behind a legacy of work that has endured for centuries, but the question remains, did I, in my pursuit of greatness, lose something more fundamental, something that no amount of fame or fortune could replace? Section 3. My poor son. He was only 11 years old. The year 1596 was a turning point in my life, and not for any reason related to my work. It was the year my son, Hamnet, died. He was just 11 years old. The cause of his death remains unknown, as there were no detailed records left behind, but it was a blow that struck me deeply, as any parent who has lost a child can understand. Even now, I can feel the weight of it, the emptiness that followed that moment, though I rarely spoke of it aloud. Hamnet was my only son, and losing him left a gaping hole in my life. He had been a part of me in a way that only a child can be. He was born in 1585, 2 years after I married Anne Hathaway. With his twin sister, Judith, they were my children. But it was Hamnet who was the namesake of my own legacy, who carried my bloodline forward. And when he passed away, so much of that future was ripped away, leaving only grief in its wake. I was living in London when I received the news of Hamnet's death. This distance, both physical and emotional, was a cruel factor in the tragedy. I had already spent much of my time away from my family, focusing on my career, and now I was left with the painful realization that I could never undo the years of absence. As I stood amidst the rush and clamor of London's theatre district, so far from the quiet town of Stratford, I could not help but feel regret. Regret for not being there more for Anne, for not being there for my children. Hamnet's death has long been speculated to have had a profound effect on my work. It is often said that my grief over his loss influenced many of the darker themes that emerged in my plays later in life. Certainly, the themes of mortality, the fragility of life, and the anguish of losing someone close are unmistakably present in some of my greatest tragedies. Hamlet, written not long after his death, reflects deep struggles with loss, grief, and the desire for meaning in the face of death. The titular character, Hamlet, is driven by the sudden death of his father and his complicated feelings about life and death, themes that echoed my own turmoil. King Lear, too, offers a narrative deeply entwined with the pain of loss. The play revolves around the aging king's loss of everything: his kingdom, his power, his family, and the profound effect it has on him. It is not hard to see parallels between Lear's suffering and my own, especially in the wake of Hamlet's death. Even as I wrote these plays, I could not escape the thoughts of my son, his absence forever present in my mind. The personal tragedy of Hamlet's passing was a sorrow I carried with me for the rest of my life. In some ways, I never fully processed it. There was no time to grieve as I had to continue working, writing, producing plays, and securing my place in the world of the theater. But the grief, the sadness, never quite left me. I never wrote about it directly in my works, but I think it lived in everything I wrote afterward, particularly in the tragedies that so deeply explore themes of death and suffering. The loss of Hamnet also marked a turning point in my relationship with Stratford. Although I continued to maintain my property there, my ties to the town had already been strained due to my long absences in London. The grief of losing my son made the distance feel even more pronounced. I had been away from my family for much of his life, and now that I could never get those years back, it only deepened the sense of isolation I felt. The grief of losing him was compounded by the realization that there were so many moments I had missed, and so many things I could never do again. After his death, I returned home to Stratford, though the details of my return are unclear. I do not know how I coped with the funeral, or what I said to Anne and Judith. My grief was private, and I did not speak of it openly. It is likely that the pain remained with me for the rest of my life, shaping my thoughts and my work in ways that even I might not have fully understood. The absence of Hamnet, and the absence of that part of my life, haunted me in my later years, especially as I watched time pass and saw the world I had left behind continue without me. There were no more children to carry on my legacy, no more sons to inherit my name. I had already seen the fragility of life in the death of my son. Perhaps that awareness, that harsh reality, is what drove some of my greatest works. In Hamlet, in King Lear, in Macbeth, the recognition of human mortality is ever present, as if I were trying, through the medium of theater, to understand it all, to come to terms with it. In some ways, the death of Hamnet has been overshadowed by the legacy I left in my plays, my poetry, and the theater I helped to shape. But even in the face of my success, the personal cost of that success remains. I never truly came to terms with the loss of Hamnet. The plays I wrote in the wake of his death may be among the finest works ever written, but they were also the product of a man grappling with a deep personal tragedy that he could never quite overcome. What we do know is that my son's death affected me in ways that words can scarcely describe. It affected my family life, my sense of identity, and my work. But it also reminds us of the human condition, of how loss and grief shape the way we live and the stories we tell. Hamlet is not just a play about a prince, it's a play about a father's mourning, a king's regret, and a man's struggle to make sense of a world filled with death. And in that, I suppose, it reflects my own heartache. I lived a long life, and I wrote some of the greatest works of literature ever produced, but I never fully escaped the pain of losing Hamnet. The legacy of his death lingers not just in my personal memories, but in the very works that continue to endure. Section 4. My Will to My Wife. When I reflect on my life, it's hard not to think about how it all ends. What will be left behind? How will I be remembered? These questions often linger, especially as you grow older. As I sit here, preparing my will, my thoughts go to Anne, my wife. Anne Hathaway, who I married when I was just 18 years old, and she was 26. There's always been some distance between us, even before I moved to London to pursue my career. In some ways, I feel that I was never truly there for her, never fully present. And I wonder now if, perhaps, that absence, that distance, is reflected in the way I've treated her in my will. When I wrote it, the decision to leave in my second best bed was one that raised many questions. I knew, as soon as I did it, that it would cause people to talk. The second best bed. Some see it as a slight, an insult, an indication that our marriage wasn't as harmonious as one might have hoped. After all, what does it say about a man who leaves his wife the second best bed, and not the best one, the one that's meant to show the most respect, the most love? Others, however, might interpret it differently, as a symbol of affection, or perhaps as a customary gesture. In the end, though, it's hard to escape the sense that it reflects something more complex than mere custom. In the years that followed our marriage, I spent much of my time away in London, working in the theatre. I know I was absent from Anne's life for long stretches, and we were living in a different time, when a man's career often took precedence over his family life. But it's not just the time apart that stands out to me, it's the feeling of distance between us. Anne, as far as I know, was always a good wife to me, but I wonder if I was as good a husband to her. I wrote plays and sonnets, and my fame grew, but at what cost? It's hard not to wonder if I neglected her in ways I never fully understood. Perhaps, in the end, the second best bed was my way of acknowledging that our marriage was not perfect, but also not without its complexities. I know that Anne did not join me in London as often as some might have expected. It wasn't easy for her to leave Stratford, and I spent many years away from her and the children. Judith and Hamnet. I left them too, although in some ways I think it was Hamlet's death in 1596 that really crystallized how much I had been absent from their lives. That was a loss that hit me hard, harder than I think I was prepared for. I was never truly present for my children, and I can't help but feel that my absence from their upbringing shaped who they became. The loss of Hamnet, in particular, left me with so many unanswered questions, and I began to understand more deeply the cost of not being there for them when they needed me. But Anne, of course, remained in Stratford. I left her behind, and yet she still stood by me, raising our children, managing our household. I think about her often, particularly in the final years of my life. How much of that time did I waste? How much of it did I squander by being away, focused on my own ambition? And when it came time to write my will, I know that the choice of the second best bed was a decision I did not take lightly. Some see it as a slight, others as a form of affection, and still, others consider it a comment on the nature of our relationship. But I think it speaks to the complexity of it all, the complicated nature of love, of marriage, of what we owed to one another, and what we failed to give. I didn't have much to give at the end of it all. I was never a rich man in terms of wealth, though my plays and poems have ensured that I've left behind a legacy of sorts. But when it came to my family, I feel as though I didn't leave them with much, not in terms of emotional fulfillment. Perhaps that's why the second best bed has become a symbol of what could have been, of a marriage that was not perfect but was nonetheless real. It's a reflection of all that I did not give to Anne, of the years I spent away from her and my family, and of the complexity of our relationship. And yet, despite everything, Anne remained my wife, and I think she knew, in her own way, how I felt. I don't know what people will think of my will or the choice I made. Perhaps they will judge me for leaving in something so seemingly insignificant, but perhaps they will understand that it's not always about the material possessions we leave behind. It's about what we have shared, the things we cannot always put into words. I suppose, in the end, the second best bed was all I had to give her. Maybe that's all anyone can ever give. A gesture, however small, that acknowledges what has passed between two people, the years spent together, the love that may not always have been as clear as it could have been, but that was always there in some form. Now, as I approach the end of my life, I know that the will be one of the things people remember about me. But I also know that it is only a small part of the story. It is the plays I wrote, the words I put down on paper, the works that have endured long after I am gone, that will outlast me. Yet, in some way, I hope people will remember the other side of me, the man who lived with a wife he wasn't always present for, the father who couldn't always be there for his children, and the person who, in the end, left only what he could, no matter how imperfect it might have been. The second best bed, what a strange legacy. But then again, isn't that what life is? A series of imperfect moments, imperfect choices, and yet, somehow, they all come together to form the story of who we are. I suppose, in the end, that's all any of us can hope for, to be remembered, not for the things we left behind, but for the lives we touched, and the words we wrote. And perhaps that will be enough.